Hi, everyone. My name is Asmar Askenom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center for Global Security Research here at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Thank you for joining today's lecture, which is entitled The Rise of the Chinese Techno Security State. Our speaker is Dr. Tai Ming Chung. Tai is no stranger to CGSR, the organization he leads, the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, which is affiliated with the University of California, collaborates often with CGSR and also with Los Alamos National Lab. Along with being the IGC director, Tai is also a professor at the University of California, San Diego. His lecture today is based on his latest book, which was published last year and is called Innovate to Dominate: The Rise of the Chinese Techno Security State. During his lecture, Tai will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll turn to the audience for a Q&A session. Tai, welcome back to CGSR. It's our pleasure to host you today as our speaker. I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Great, thanks very much, Asmar. It's like, and it is great to do this with one of our closest partners, both within the UC system and nationally itself. So what I wanted to do today is to provide sort of like a broad overview. So if you can start the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, thank you, Katie. So over the last couple of decades, an area that I've been focused upon is try to understand the relationship between national security, innovation, especially technological innovation, and the role of the state in playing sort of like these sort of very different sort of dimensions of a state's development itself. And over the last decade or so, sort of the emergence of what I call a techno-security state under the reign of Xi Jinping has become even more and more apparent. And that precedes sort of like the US-China great power competition itself, but it's but the increasing sort of competition between the US and China in the innovation space, in the security space, in the military space, has really had a profound impact on shaping the nature of the Chinese techno-security state, which I'll define shortly, and what its sort of trajectory over the long term. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about where the Chinese techno-security state has come from, where it is today, and where it's going over the long term itself. Next slide. So sort of the techno-security sort of domain is where I define it as where national security, technological innovation, military power, and economic development, this is where they converge itself. And this is sort of at the epicenter of the US-China sort of great power competition today. This is clearly stated in Chinese sort of strategies and plans, but also in the sort of like in how the US and the White House in particular looks at these types of issues in the national security strategy that came out in the fall of last year. It's said that China is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order, especially in the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological domains. And China is the only power to really be able to challenge the US itself. And that this next decade is going to be the decisive sort of time for this competition itself. Next slide. And so what I wanted to do before we get going is to sort of like provide sort of a historical context about where the current US and China techno-security competition is compared to the last time that the US was engaged in such a techno-security competition, which was in the Cold War in the second half of the 20th century itself. Next slide. So in sort of the second half of the 20th century, after the end of the Second World War, the U.S. found itself engaged in in a great power competition. Initially, it was in a traditional Cold War with the Soviet Union, which was primarily focused on defense and on ideological itself. But further on, in the 60s and 70s, especially the 1980s, there was also a different type of great power competition, which was in the geo-economic domain, and that was principally against Japan. So if you look at reimagining the second half of the 20th century, the US found itself in a military Cold War and a geo-economic competition, one against the Soviet Union and the other against Japan. And a very important characteristic was that the U.S. competed against the Soviet Union, against Japan, but they were in very compartmentalized domains. The competition against the Soviet Union was primarily focused on defense and and military competition with the ideological dimension. And against Japan was a close treaty partner, so there was no competition on the military domain, but this was all primarily in the commercial spheres, in civilian commercial areas, and the overlap was negligible. There wasn't very much in terms of dual use. These two countries occupy very different compartmentalized areas. The US, though, was competing in both these areas, so the US was set up very differently. Next slide. The US was what we call an integrated techno security state. The US had a very strong defense industrial apparatus, and it also had a very strong commercial apparatus. And where these two merged in the innovation domain, they the US had the research and development systems that could support competition in both these domains. And this this integrated techno security apparatus was one of the key reasons why the US was able to compete effectively and win against the Soviet Union in the defense domains, and then against Japan in the civilian commercial domains. Next slide. The main difference between the great power / Cold War competition against the Soviet Union and Japan in the 20th century with China today is that China is very different compared to the Soviets and the Japanese. The Chinese techno security state, as we see it in the 21st century, is much more closely integrated compared with the US. There's no compartmentalization of the defense and the commercial spheres as it was against the Soviet Union and Japan. And so the US finds itself that dealing with China, it's it faces a a rival that has a very strong defense sphere. It has a a very competitive commercial sphere, and there's a growing and expanding dual use area itself. So the nature of the Cold War / great power competition today against China is very, very different than compared with the Soviet Union and Japan in the 20th century. Next slide. And I will towards the end of the presentation, I'll go and examine the nature of this US-China techno security competition and what is the critical differences between these two systems. But before I do that, I want to go and explain a brief overview of the makeup and the nature of the Chinese techno security state today in the early 2020s. Next slide. So China under Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping's been in power since 2012, so he's been in place for more than a decade now, is what I would define as is a security maximizing state that is building its power and its prestige on a very capable economic and technological foundation itself. And China is sort of like a techno security state in which a lot of the development efforts that has been the priority focus for the Chinese authorities is increasingly focused on expansive national security requirements. This wasn't always the case. Sort of like sort of when China emerged sort of like from sort of like its Cold War past in at the end of the 1970s, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, under the reign of Deng Xiaoping, then Jiang Zemin, and then Hu Jintao, China was what we would define as a developmental state, where the focus was on economic development and how to maximize sort of like so the pursuit of economic prosperity. Under Xi Jinping, he has sort of like sort of changed this sort of like priorities where economic development remains important, but it's sort of been overtaken now. And this has become especially clear sort of like in the last few years, where it's national security that is the chief priority. And so now sort of the focus is on sort of adjusting the relationship between economic development and national security, and where national security is the foremost priority. So how does the Chinese state, if sort of more effectively coordinate this national security, this innovation, and these economic systems? Next slide. And sort of in the presentation and like and sort of in far more detail in the book that I that came out last year, I look at sort of in particular sort of like sort of four key areas of the rise of this Chinese techno security state under Xi Jinping itself, where it's like there is this focus on innovation. In particular, sort of like there's a sort of like a new grand strategy called the innovation-driven development strategy that came out in the first few years of Xi Jinping's first term in 2015, 2016, whereas the focus is on developing sort of an economic development model where previously under his predecessors, it was all about export-led sort of like low-end industrial development. To today, the focus is on high-end advanced innovation itself. A second area is on national security, and how what we see under Xi Jinping is the rise of a national security state, where I said the security issues are very, very prominent. Then there's a third dimension, which is called military civil fusion, about how you develop a integrated dual use system where you leverage sort of the defense apparatus with the civilian apparatus. And then a final part is on sort of military strengthening, is how does this all sort of this technical security state contribute to the development sort of and the transformation of China's military power, sort of like over the long term itself. And so these different elements goes into the Chinese techno security state. And I'm going to talk about sort of three of these elements. Not I don't have enough time to go into all of that. But first, beginning with the national security strategy. Next slide. So a key reason why Xi Jinping sort of like places sort of top priority on national security as opposed to development compared to his predecessors was that when he came to power in 2012, he brought a very different view about China's place in the world, and in particular, how he thought about sort of like the national security threats that China faced. under his predecessors, sort of from Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, sort of like these regimes, they saw China's national security in very traditional sort of like realpolitik terms. It was all about sort of the balance of power. It was all about sort of like hard security. And it's sort of all about sort of like looking at sort of like the nature of the international system and whether that threatened China's security. And from sort of this sort of like sort of realist perspective on the world, China had a sort of fairly traditional view that it's like, well, while there may have been sort of like ups and downs in the global balance of power, sort of at the beginning of the 2010s, just before Xi Jinping comes to power, China enjoyed a relatively benign sort of like world sort of like environment. There were sort of some minor threats to China's security, but by and large, China was relatively safe. Under Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping sort of like he comes to power and he hasn't really served much time in the central leadership. Much of his career was served as a provincial sort of party apparatchik who was dealing with sort of Communist Party affairs. And when he comes to power, he said he looks at sort of the policy system, and he looks at the national security perspective, and he says, I really don't agree with this view about sort of this realpolitik, this realist perspective on assessing China's national security. So that's important. But to me, he says, the most important view is that national security should be viewed from a political lens itself, and a political and ideological lens, which means that to him, sort of the national security, the most important part of national security is about ensuring the security, stability of the political system, which meant that it was all about the security of the Communist Party, and that the Communist Party needed to remain at the center of power. And how do you secure that? And one sort of like telling example of this perspective was that when Xi Jinping comes to power, it's like one of the things that he talks about quite a bit is like that sort of there were China learned the wrong lessons about the downfall of the Soviet Union itself. That it's like when the Soviet Union sort of fell back in the late 1980s. So this was seen to be because the Soviet Union sort of like was defeated in this great power competition in this Cold War against the US. It was about sort of military sort of like collapse, sort of like, and the collapse of sort of the political, the economic system itself. Xi Jinping said, no, the most important reason why the Soviet Union collapsed was because of sort of the collapse of the Communist Party and the lack of belief sort of in the communist system. So Xi Jinping says, like, so we now have to really sort of like focus on redefining what we mean by national security. I mean, the military and the power politics and the realpolitik part remains important, but at the very, very top, it's about political security, about ensuring domestic security, ensuring that sort of like the Communist Party is strong. And so next slide. And so what Xi Jinping says is that like we really need to revamp the nature of the national security apparatus itself. That it's like the Chinese national security apparatus was sort of like compartmentalized. And when Xi Jinping takes power, there's one part which is the domestic part that deals with domestic threats, domestic unrest, etc. That was compartmentalized from the external part, the military or the intelligence apparatus that dealt with the conventional realpolitik issues. And he said we need to combine these elements into a comprehensive national security that deals with both the political and the economic and the military and those different parts of security. So security then becomes comprehensive. What he says is holistic. That is it's not, we cannot sort of see sort of national security just from a military lens or just from an economic lens. We need to see it in all these different parts integrated. And also in this reconceptualization of national security, he says it's there's new threats. It's threats in particular that comes from non-traditional, from emerging arenas. And sort of he talks about the it's these boats from the blue, what he often calls these black swan or gray rhino events that that it's that China needs to be prepared from these sort of boats from out of the blue that that they don't really are not expected or not prepared for. And one of the key areas that he talks about is when the pandemic comes in 2020. It comes from nowhere, and China needs to be prepared from that. And what this all means, that this new this very, very different view on our national security is that from a relatively benign perspective of China's place in the world before Xi Jinping comes to power, when she is in power, and going forwards, this benign view is changed and is turned upside down, that China is increasingly facing a very threatening environment, that there's these political threats. This is what you get from the threats internally with Xinjiang, or more recently with Hong Kong or with Taiwan, etc. These means that China is has to face a very heightened security environment. Next slide. And so this is the national security part, and then it's then another key part is on military strengthening itself. And so, as I said, it's Xi Jinping, even though he emphasizes the importance of political security, of regime security, he also pays a lot of attention on this traditional military security itself. I mean, it's when he comes to power, one that he allocates significant amount of his time to visit the military apparatus, go to all parts of the military system, etc. And he formulates his own guidance about how he sees the role of the military, and in particular, how does China transform its military power. So one of the things he asks his military commanders whenever he goes into the field is so he says, the People's Liberation Army, it's the world's largest military itself, but it's very large. But he says, why isn't it very strong? Which means that why there's a lot of quantity, but there's not sufficient quality. And so Xi Jinping says we have to transform the People's Liberation Army and the related defense industrial and technological base from being just about size and about being highly capable. So this is his focus then, his guidance is called military strengthening in the new era itself. And and this military strengthening, initially it's about building up the Chinese military comprehensive capabilities in terms of its science and technology, its power projection, etc. But then it's during the course of his rule, and especially in his second term, from the late 2010s, there's a focus on not just a generic buildup of Chinese military capability from being a regional power to become a global military power. It's about dealing with potential threats itself to sort of China's sort of security itself. Initially, this is focused in the South China Sea, and so there's a focus on building up sort of like these fortified sort of shoals and turn them into sort of islands in the Spratly Islands. But then the issue of Taiwan rears up, and sort of like how does China sort of develop the capabilities to fend off sort of like Taiwan's sort of search for sort of independence itself. And in recent years, this has also become transformed into dealing with great power military competition against the US. So there's all these sort of elements of like, so when this military strengthening starts, it's relatively modest goes, then it sort of snowballs into sort of like into increasingly sort of building up a much more sort of capable and expansive military system. And you can sort of see this sort of like in some of the timelines that Xi Jinping set at sort of like when he sort of gets his second term at the, which is sort of announced and anointed at the 19th Party Congress in 2017. Xi Jinping sets the timeline for this military strengthening when he says at the 19th Party Congress that by 2035, sort of like the PLA will achieve its defense modernization goals itself. And by 2050, the PLA will begin to challenge for global leadership in the military sphere, which in other words is going to begin to challenge the US. Next slide. But as this great power competition intensifies in the second term, as the concerns about sort of Taiwan also intensify during the second term, Xi Jinping when he's appointed to his third term last year at the 20th Party Congress, he has a new timeline. As previously in 2017, the focus was on 2035 as the first timeline. He moves this timeline to 2027 when he says we need to work faster to modernize sort of our entire military system, both in terms of military doctrines and strategies, sort of the human talent, the organizations, the weapons, and the equipment. So this is sort of like military innovation on a multi-dimensional scale. And he talks about the need to establish strong strategic deterrence capabilities and build, increase the emphasis on building major projects. And a lot of this is about developing and expanding sort of China's nuclear capabilities, but also developing sort of like large scale, sort of high end, sort of revolutionary capabilities, hypersonics, sort of like quantum capabilities, and all those spheres, etc. A lot of sort of like, so what we see is an accelerated emphasis on building sort of the Chinese military, both in terms of its core traditional focus as a large-scale sort of conventional military, sort of like ground force orientated force, but also building up these sort of like these sort of high-end, high-quality sort of what some of the parlance is the anti-access area denial strategic capabilities in space, in cyber, in nuclear, in the maritime domain. Next slide. And sort of the third part is military civil fusion. So how do you do sort of all this sort of like sort of very, very sort of expensive, sort of like very, very sophisticated, sort of a very advanced capabilities. And in the past, much of this would have been done within sort of like the defense industrial apparatus. But Xi Jinping, he says is like, well, that's important, but that's not sufficient. We need to tap into the rest of the Chinese economy. So he also emphasizes the importance of developing military civil fusion itself. How to build up sort of like a tightly integrated, sort of like comprehensive sort of civil military, sort of like technological and industrial system. Um, a lot of this is aspirational because sort of like the Chinese economy for the past sort of 6 decades until recently has been very much focused on compartmentalizing the military and the civilian spheres. And so although Xi Jinping says we want military civil fusion, the reality is that it's really, really difficult. There's a lot of entrenched interests. Most of the civilian economy, especially the private sector, they don't really understand what military sort of like requirements are, and they're very reluctant to engage in sort of like in military work because it's very, very expensive. There's a lot of sort of like secrecy, and there's a lot of sort of state intervention itself. And so this military civil fusion is something that Xi Jinping is pushing, but it's still got a very long way before they actually achieve that itself. Next slide. And more recently, we've seen sort of the emergence of a new sort of focus in the rise of this techno security state, is the focus on economic securitization, and that is in large part because of sort of the U.S. efforts to try to sort of contain and slow China's technological development with sort of like sort of more robust export controls, the imposition of sanctions on Chinese high-tech companies like Huawei and ZTE, etc. And so what the Chinese authorities, especially sort of in the last few years, has emphasized is that we need to securitize the key parts of the Chinese economy, especially the science and technology sector, the research and development base, the supply chains, a lot of it's sort of like high-tech companies, etc. And the focus of this economic securitization is on self-reliance, about how you build resilience and sort of independence, sort of like and homegrown capability, especially in semiconductors, sort of like especially on sort of advanced manufacturing capability, etc. So what we've seen is like this emphasis on building sort of a very sort of securitized economy has become a very, very important emphasis in the last couple of years. Next slide. And this is sort of gonna sort of continue on itself. Um, um, the question today is securitization sufficient for the Chinese economy, especially with concerns over Taiwan with this military buildup? Or do they need to shift from securitization to militarization, that they need to really build up sort of their military industrial base, especially what we've seen with the war in the Ukraine, and sort of like and how that has stretched the existing defense industrial bases in the West, in Russia, in sort of like in other sort of major countries. These are also the questions that the Chinese are facing. Does their so like both their dual use, the civil military base, but also their defense industrial base, is it sufficient if they have to go to fight against Taiwan or against the US anytime soon? Next slide. Next slide. Um, and sort of one of the key areas. So let's see. I've been going on for a bit, so I'm going to skip this stage and then sort of go to the last section. If you continue on. I'll sort of forget. Comparing the US and Chinese techno security states, because this is sort of a key part. Um, as I said sort of earlier on, it's like, I mean, the US and the Chinese techno security systems, in many ways, they're a lot alike when we sort of distinguish them from the Soviet and the Japanese sort of states back during the Cold War. So who is the stronger, and sort of like and who's going to win sort of this long-term great power competition? Next slide. So while the US and Chinese techno security states are very similar in terms of the integration between sort of like the military and the civilian portions of the economies, they're fundamentally very different in terms of how they're organized and managed itself. The Chinese techno security state that I've talked about is what very much sort of like what we call it's a statist system where it's very top down and it's state led, and sort of like and the private sector and the market plays a secondary supporting role. The US techno security state is very much of an anti-statist state, sort of like techno security system, where it's sort of very much of a bottom-up, a market driven, where the state has traditionally sort of played a more limited role and has allowed sort of more of the market, of the private sector, sort of the primes, etc., to take a more sort of like primary role in sort of in security development itself. And this fundamental difference between this statist nature of the Chinese techno security state and the anti-statist nature of the US techno security, this is where sort of who wins and who loses will be fundamentally sort of determined. Next slide. And so this sort of explains these different systems. Next slide. Next slide. And when we look at sort of like sort of the strengths and weaknesses of the US versus the Chinese techno security states, in my book, sort of like I detail sort of there's sort of 5 key areas or 5 key factors to sort of determine like who wins and who loses, etc. The first is in terms of sort of which country has has sort of a clearer sense of what the external threat perceptions are and how those threats drive sort of like their preparedness. And in many ways, sort of China, it has the advantage in this. China has identified the US as its main techno security threat ever since sort of the late 1990s, because of the threats in the Taiwan Straits in the mid 1990s, but also because of sort of like events such as the US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in May of 1999. Sort of like at that time, the Chinese saw that the US was their main strategic threat. And so they began to engage in a major sort of modernization and development of these anti-access area denial capabilities at the end of the 1990s, the beginning of the 21st century. The US during the beginning of the 21st century, this was its focus was on a global war on terrorism with the 9/11 terrorist attack. And so as China was engaged in this major buildup against the US, the development of their deterrence capability, the US was focused on the Middle East and against Afghanistan, and it wasn't until sort of like the mid 2010s, and towards the end of the Obama administration, and then sort of like at the beginning of the Trump administration, did the US begin to identify the China as its primary threat. And even today, sort of, although the focus is on China, if you actually look at sort of the investments efforts that the US is making, it's still sort of the US has not mobilized sort of like its techno security state to the same extent that the Chinese have, etc. And all of this is because of these sort of threat perceptions. So the Chinese have an advantage in terms of sort of like clearly seeing the US as its overwhelming threat and mobilizing its capabilities for that. The US is still sort of lagging a little bit behind that, although that's changing. A second key component is the nature and configuration of these leadership systems and the management of the techno security states. And in many ways, it's like this is a draw. The US has this as I said, this anti-status, this bottom-up market-driven system. The Chinese have this top-down sort of status system, and these systems have both their advantages and disadvantages. The advantage for the Chinese status system is that in periods of major technological revolutionary change, as what we're experiencing today, sort of the Chinese status system tends to perform better because the state intervenes, and it takes and it's willing to take a greater sense of risk. While sort of like market-driven systems, they don't like revolutionary change because they don't know how where to invest. They don't see where the trajectory and where the returns on investment, and so state-driven systems tend to do better in periods of revolutionary technological change, etc. Once these changes have occurred, the anti-state the market system tends to perform much better because the companies then know how to invest, what the risks are, and they're much more efficient. So today, the broader techno security paradigm sort of favors more the Chinese system, but it's but the US still has its advantages. The third key area to assess strengths and weaknesses is the nature of the governance regimes, etc. So the Chinese status system, how does it get the rest of the economy to engage and mobilize and support its techno security priorities? The Chinese communist system uses coercion and penalties that rather than in the US system. In the US system, the US system uses incentives like profits and and other types of benefits. And so the Chinese system is it tells companies if you don't participate in these programs, it's they often say we'll arrest your leaders, or we'll penalize you with by not giving you access to key markets. So the Chinese governance motto tends to be using threats and coercion, doesn't really get the best of the economy. The US has a far more superior and sustainable model by using market competition, by using profits as these incentives itself. And in many ways, this is a very, very serious Achilles heel of the Chinese model. Next slide. A fourth area, can we go back? Go back one slide. So the fourth area is public-private and civil-military relationships itself. And this is an area that the US also has an advantage. The US system, where it's relationship between the state and market, it's a much more balanced and a much more effective system, or it was during the Cold War, where sort of like the government sort of took a limited role, but it sort of like but it worked very closely, and things like sort of FFDRCs, like sort of what Livermore has with the uh, with the Department of Energy. So the US developed a whole range of very effective public-private partnerships, as well as sort of civil-military integration, especially a lot of the prime contractors did both civilian and military work, etc. The Chinese system, they don't have a very good public-private partnership. The state dominates, and the private sector really sort of like is subordinate. And as I said, their military civil fusion is still at a very, very early stage. And so the US system is very, very effective, although there's been a lot of stagnation sort of like in the US system. And lastly, in terms of sort of like engagement with partners and allies, the Chinese techno security system tends to be very techno nationalist. It tends to sort of like it doesn't have a very, very strong cohort of allies and partners around the world, in part because like it's been sort of like it hasn't had a system where it's been able to export its technologies, its know-how in a very, very sort of like effective manner until recently. So the US has developed sort of a very sort of like a globally dominant sort of techno security system, and a lot of countries have been very sort of keen to work with the US, and the US is developing these sort of these global techno security partnerships with AUKUS, and sort of like with the Five Eyes evolving into sort of like some new technological domains. And so in terms of how China or the US relates to the rest of the world, in particular the advanced parts of the world, the US has a far superior position. And so when you look at sort of these five areas, China is ahead on one in terms of the threat perceptions. They are sort of the US and China are drawn on two in terms of the leadership models for their techno security states. But the US has decisive advantages in three of these other areas itself. Next slide, which I think is the final slide. And so in terms of the sort of this net assessment, is that overall is the US as a far more sort of superior system. But it's like, but the problem, as I said, for the US system is that there's a lot of stagnation. A lot of the superiority of the US system was developed and won during the Cold War. In the post-Cold War era, and especially today, there's like, it's sort of like the US is trying to sort of get its mojo back from the Cold War, but it's finding that sort of like there's sort of like a lot of problems, such like with the acquisition system, sort of the sort of like the divided politics has meant it's very, very difficult for Congress to be able to mobilize and to sort of come up with sort of like key initiatives that they were able to do during the height of the Cold War. I mean, even we see sort of with the Biden administration, with the Chips and Science Act, etc., they've been able to pass some of this legislation, but getting funding is a different matter. For China, given that it's authoritarian nature, it doesn't have these checks and balances in place. So Xi Jinping, with his techno security state sort of approach, it's like they are much more effective at raising funding and pursuing this. But their problem is the implementation is also problematic, because they have sort of like a lot of sort of like problems for governance, for sort of overactive dominance of the state system itself. And so I'll end it here. It's like one of the complaints that some people have about my book is that I don't come to a conclusion. I don't say who wins and who loses, because it's a very sort of like complicated discussion, and it's like and that's given the ending away before anyone's read the book.